Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and today our guest is Professor Mridu Rais. An associate professor in the history department at Yale, Professor Rais' doctoral research focused on the problems of religion, politics, and protest in modern Kashmir. It culminated in her book, Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects, Islam, Rights, and the History of Kashmir. She is here to talk with us today about her new research in the region of Bihar, India, that explores the relationships between caste, territory, region, and nation as they evolved from the period of British colonial rule into the post-colonial era. Welcome, Professor Rais.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So in your newest book, which you are currently in the process of writing, you look at the caste system in India, specifically in the region of Bihar. Mm-hmm. What is caste?
An interesting question, a very broad question. The term caste itself has no Indian origin. It's derived from the Portuguese term casta. And yet, of course, the phenomenon of caste is very Indian. It's marked as one of the essences, according to some writers, of Indian society itself. The phenomenon of caste derives literally from ancient times in India itself. A verse in the ancient text, the Rig Veda, composed in roughly 1200 BC, mentions the division of society along 4 lines, and a hierarchical division of society that had Brahmins, the priestly or sacerdotal classes, at the top, the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, as second in rank, the Vaishyas, those producing the wealth of society, merchant groups, richer landowning groups, third in rank, and then a category called Shudras, sort of providing menial labor as fourth in rank. Eventually, through the history of India, a fifth category was added, namely that of the untouchables, quote unquote, who, again, the origins of untouchability and these untouchable groups is varied and not fully explained in the history. But these 5 divisions, in fact, simply form the theoretical peg against which another category must be added, that of jati. Jati literally means birth. And when Indians talk about caste, they actually allude to that concept of jati. And by some surveys, there are about 3,000 jatis in India, and they seem to be pegged in various ways against this 4 and then 5-fold division along the lines of caste. What is important to remember is that, of course, these are not set categories. They're not deprived of history. That over the centuries of the existence of these categories, there's been a great deal of mobility both upwards and downwards. However, if we look at caste in the early 21st century, it certainly represents a certain, a very distinct sort of hierarchical division, certainly amongst Hindus, but caste has actually had this strange sort of effect of permeating into different religious groups and religious communities that have existed in the subcontinent as well. So in India, you could even think of Brahmin Christians and Shudra Christians. Islam, which is such an egalitarian religion, also in its in the social existence of Muslim communities, displays some of these notions of hierarchical ranking. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it's caste, as we understand it today, is literally a certain kind of hierarchical ranking that seems peculiar to the South Asian subcontinent. It doesn't match up with categories of class. Mobility has become more restricted, and that sort of removal of flexibility within caste is dated to the more modern period of India's history.
Mm-hmm. And what drew you to this topic?
Again, as I said, this is a highly hierarchical system, And some of the hierarchies are maintained through extreme violence. In contemporary India, for instance, the subordination that is subjected, to which lower caste groups are subjected is violent. It's shockingly violent, but yet is commented upon very rarely. We're more used to, especially sitting in the West, we're more used to thinking about the Indian subcontinent in terms of the more usual rivalries along religious lines, Hindu versus Muslim, or national lines, India versus Pakistan, Sinhala versus Tamil, linguistic regional lines. Caste is addressed as the essence of India, but not discussed enough, I think. There is a quotidian kind of violence that characterizes the operation of caste itself. And this is despite the fact that the Indian Constitution, enacted finally in 1950, framed and given to the people of India in 1949, abolished untouchability through various articles. It abolished the principle of discrimination along the lines of caste. So in principle, the state in India does not recognize caste. And yet the history of India has shown that caste, far from fading away, has returned to the fold of politics in India itself. And those politics have produced remarkable results. I mean, we have in the most populous state of India, the state of Uttar Pradesh, we have a woman chief minister. First of all, gender, in terms of gender itself, this is a remarkable change, but she's also, I mean, again, South Asia, the subcontinent is familiar with sort of women in power, but this is a woman who comes from, in fact, the most subordinated groups, from, in fact, an untouchable group. And yet, the violence along caste lines, the daily brutalities that are meted out to people along the sort of the lower rungs of this hierarchy that still exists, is not acknowledged often enough. So for me, I remember hearing that almost 18,000 people died. Dalits, untouchable, subordinated groups died and violence meted out to them in just the space of a decade was shocking enough, and yet that it wasn't recognized.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about your book. What is the premise?
Okay, I'm a historian, and I'm trying to navigate actually between sort of enormously weighty scholarship. I would summarize the sort of the debates within that scholarship along, as separated along two very broadly put lines. One school of thought that says that, well, caste, of course, existed before the British arrived in India, but colonial rule turned it into a system. That the mechanisms of establishing colonial rule through institutions like taking the census on a decennial basis, through sort of making available political power along lines of caste and religious belonging, sort of turned what was a much more variegated system, a much more variegated phenomenon rather, into a system that begins to apply on the all India sort of landscape, as it were. And then there's another body of scholarship, equally weighty, equally important, that says, well, certainly British rule changed some of the premises within which caste began to function as a system, but the colonial state certainly did not invent caste. That in fact it predated the arrival of the British. I'm trying to navigate my way between these very, very sort of serious blocks of scholarship, if I may use a shorthand. For me, I think after a point, it matters little who invented caste into a system. What is interesting to me is that is to find out how it's experienced. What does it mean when you look beyond the colonial state? it can be no one's argument that caste didn't exist before the British arrived in India, and it can certainly be no one's argument that the British didn't actually transform all kinds of social imaginings, including that of caste. But how was it actually experienced? So for me, I want to move away from a line of thinking that still, I mean, no matter how disparate and sort of oppositional these two perspectives might seem, both agree that something happens under colonial rule that changes the way in which caste affects Indians. I take a line that says, well, yes, but to understand caste functions even as late as in the late 19th century, when the colonial state has census enumeration that makes caste into a reality. Even then, what is changing is literally the spaces within which caste functions. Caste makes no sense outside of locality. I want to bring in this whole notion of ideas of mutuality and reciprocity, that caste always existed, I take as a premise. Relations based along a hierarchy of caste always existed in localities. What changes is the arena within which suddenly caste domination has to be asserted through violence. I want to ask why. You can, I mean, by the late 20th century, and certainly even earlier than that, by the early 20th century, why does it take violence to maintain caste? Where for centuries there was a quieter violence. I mean, I do not believe that caste was ever a benevolent institution. That caste is touched through and through by oppression is evident. That it is touched through and through by subordination is evident. But how do we explain the fact that today it takes the form of warfare? And I want to argue that in fact what is happening through the late 19th century is not so much a greater amplification of caste identities, that it's something else, that in fact caste identities always existed. What is happening is in fact perhaps a fragmentation of the localities, the communities within which caste had always demanded both mutuality and reciprocity, even in a system that is highly unequal, that it was possible for lower caste to say, wait, hang on, I call upon you to fulfill your duties. Something begins to change in actually societies throughout northern India through the late 19th century, whereby in fact upper castes don't have to maintain that pattern of mutuality. They function in a different arena.
Okay, so why did you select the region of Bihar?
Yes. An easy answer would be, first of all, that I'm from Bihar, but that's too easy an answer because my first work had nothing to do with Bihar, it had to do with Kashmir. Bihar, well, I mean, part of the answer is indeed that I'm from Bihar. It's a question of wanting to tap into a whole variety of sources in the vernacular, in sort of the more high standard Hindi and Urdu that I can access. But most of all, because Bihar is deemed to be that signal region in the Indian subcontinent that is wrecked and racked by caste violence. Even more tragically, I mean, thousands of deaths occur in Bihar along the lines, ostensibly in the name of caste violence, but it is deemed to be natural to Bihar. Nobody is surprised by this. I speak to friends of mine and say, did you see that story in Bihar? I mean, upper caste just burned down the villages of at least 2 villages and beheaded 23 people. And, it shocked me to hear their reaction saying, yeah, well, Bihar, right? It happens in Bihar. Why are you so surprised by it? I wanted to investigate that. Bihar is deemed to be this province that has no regional identity, that it's that any sense of commonality along the lines of region, language constantly found us on the lines of caste. My first book, actually, on Kashmir, sort of explored a different dimension, saying, wait, in the case of Kashmir, people always talk about a regional identity that overcomes constantly in this miraculous way religious divisions, Hindu versus Muslim, all forgotten, until it goes sour. Bihar, on the other hand, is the opposite case. It's always spoken of as the opposite case. That region that is incapable of a regional identity, where caste is overwhelming. So for me, in some ways, that was a point of curiosity that grew literally from my first work. Again, as I said, I mean, in Bihar, caste violence is deemed to be endemic. People don't use the term caste violence, they use the term caste warfare. I mean, we're talking about upper caste groups with their own private armies that are deployed to extract the labor and services of lower caste or subordinated caste groups who resist that exploitation. So there's some legitimacy to using that term warfare if you're talking about armies. Suddenly caste seems to be the only sort of characteristic of that province of Bihar, and I thought that would be a very good place to begin. And as I said, I mean, I come from there, and literally, I thought it would be, and the questions are raised literally from my first work itself. So.
Okay. Let's talk about your research. Can you give us some ideas of what you needed to do in terms of pulling information together and data?
It's been an interesting experience. As I said, part of the temptation of working on Bihar was the fact that I actually I have a thorough knowledge of the vernaculars of the region. So I've had an interesting time trying to move from my training as a historian that has so far allowed me to look at colonial sources. And those are available plentifully between the National Archives in New Delhi and the British Library's own sort of India Office Library archival material. I certainly use those. I access those with great abandon and enjoy doing that. But this time I've been trying to sort of supplement that material with vernacular sources, such as poetry, and especially if you're trying to retrieve a sense of how caste is experienced, rather than that debate that I'd spoken about earlier in terms of, well, did the colonial state invent it, or was there something that preceded it? Well, experiencing caste requires actually culling material produced by ideally subordinated groups. But of course, you're talking about groups that don't leave a written record. But I've had enormous good luck in actually at least retrieving sort of, a genre of poetry produced by migratory labor groups. It's amazing. I mean, Bihar sent out a fair section of its population outside of the state because it's such an impoverished state. Large numbers of men and women would leave to find work in Calcutta. So I've been using, they would be a former major section of the indigent labor that was sent out to Fiji and Mauritius, etc. Some of them actually left records in the form of poetry, letters. I've been using those kinds of materials to actually try and cull a sense of what it meant to feel the burden of caste, not as caste, but caste as a lived experience, the exploitation, where it is that you might find justice. Actually, my work literally is titled Geographies of Justice. It's an attempt to retrieve those spaces, not geographical spaces necessarily, but those mental and geographical spaces where you are allowed to invoke a sense of justice, to correct the wrongs that are visited upon you by this thing that we talk about so easily as the caste system itself. So it's been a challenging bit of research, but I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
And in terms of the premise of your book, in the end, what do you think your research will find?
I think at the end of the day, I hope to complicate this issue of how caste is thought about. If you don't look at the localities within which caste functions, I mean, the Constitution of India, I think, in abolishing untouchability or abolishing discrimination along the lines of caste it was very right-headed. The message was certainly one to be applauded, but that's what is, that's a message that comes on from on high. How it gets implemented on the ground requires a certain understanding of how caste functions literally on the ground. And on the ground, I mean, no matter how much caste may have been constructed by the colonial state into an all-India white system, I still find that actually caste is manifest in localities. I want to suggest that, even if you take the region of Bihar itself, that's too large to be a locality, but that's certainly bringing the debate down to a region. Within that region, I think if you begin to look at the way in which caste, what went wrong is not the emphasis of caste, but the breakdown in patterns of interrelationship that had placed caste groups in close social proximity to each other. That fragmenting of that proximity is I think what allowed certain caste groups to meet violence on other caste groups. I hope that this research suggests that, hang on, that's the way to begin to correct it. I mean, caste hasn't disappeared. No matter what, what the Indian Constitution says, no matter how that message is carried forth by high-minded civil servants as they conduct the business of the state at the level of the small district and the village, it hasn't disappeared. And it won't disappear simply by wishing it away. I hope that my work sort of shows the relationships, the tiny but very vital relationships that both kept castes in together. Again, always an unequal relationship, certainly. But the corrective is keeping them together, not prizing them apart, or not sort of blinding ourselves to the fact that, 61 years on from independence, India is still sort of beset by the nightmare of caste violence. As I said, I was shocked to find that a figure like 18,000 incidences of violence perpetrated against the Dalits, the ground down lowest castes of India. And I hope that this work is a contribution to sort of at least understanding the way in which that relationship works and what makes it fragment into violence.
Okay, and do you have a title for your book yet?
Working title, Geographies of Justice, Caste and Violence in Colonial North India.
And any estimated time of arrival?
Inshallah. By the end of the summer, I hope I've crafted the final chapters, and then we'll see.
Okay, wonderful.
We'll see.
Thanks very much for being with us with us here today.
Thanks very much, Marilyn.
Okay.
It was a pleasure speaking with you.
For more information about Professor Rai and, of course, her research and newest book, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.